Some of you who are new to classical liberalism, I hope you'll come back when we have a, maybe not such a great speaker. Today we have Mia Hughes. She researches gender issues for Civilization Works. In case you haven't followed it, it's Michael Schellenberger's organization. Defending the pillars of civilization: free speech, cheap energy, meritocracy, law and order, equal justice, free and fair elections, and childhood. Some great issues. She's the author of the WPATH Files, which is the report based on leaked internal communications from the World Professional Association for Transgender Health. Her research focuses on controversies surrounding pediatric gender medicine, as well as in the field of psychiatry plays in the current psychiatric epidemic of gender dysphoria. She aims to contextualize the contemporary trans phenomenon by comparing it to similar historical events, including lobotomies and epidemics of hysteria and multiple personality disorder. Despite swallowing half of that, welcome, Mia, and let's go. We're going to aim for 11:45. Mia is not an economist, so requests that we keep it to very short clarifying questions, and then there will be time for question and answer afterwards.
Thank you, John, and thank you everyone for being here. So before I get to this historical arc of hysteria to gender dysphoria, I'm going to tell you just a little bit of personal information about myself. So I have a background in teaching, and in 2020 I was teaching my own children. I was homeschooling because it was COVID. And for a few months, I had been aware that things were not quite right about the gender issue, trans stuff, but I couldn't really place it all together. I was trying to make sense of it. And in 2020, at some point, my eyes landed on this graph. So this shows the referrals to the Pediatric Gender Service in London that is now closed, and that's a whole seminar in and of itself, what happened there. And perhaps because it was COVID, we were living through a pandemic, or perhaps just because I know what an epidemic looks like on a graph, when I looked at this, I knew that I was looking at an epidemic. But that wasn't really what piqued my interest and started the obsession with this issue. What really fascinated me was that we were all pretending that this was perfectly fine. We were all pretending that this enormous surge in adolescent girls with a very clear inflection point was something to celebrate, was not a problem at all. And anyone who raised the alarm was painted as being transphobic, bigoted, and they faced persecution. So I was really interested in what the social phenomenon was, what was going on with this graph. And that's the subject of my talk today. So to explain, I'm going to take you back to an unlikely place. This is Bordeaux in 1887, and we're going to talk about the fugue epidemic, which very few people know about. It only lasted for 22 years, and it was men would snap into a trance-like state and walk for hundreds of miles, sometimes across Europe, not knowing where they were going or who they were, and then they would get picked up by the police and they would get taken back home, stay home for a few days, few weeks, few months, and then they'd be off again. It was triggered by a man called Albert Dada and his doctor, Philippe Tissier. And so Albert would go on these extraordinary expeditions all the way as far as Moscow, Algeria. And the reason I've chosen fugue to start is because of this book, Mad Travelers, by the Canadian philosopher Ian Hacking. Now, if you don't know anything about Ian Hacking, he wrote extensively on many subjects, but he wrote about the multiple personality disorder epidemic that raged in the 1980s, 1990s. We'll get to that later. And at the time, he wrote about it while it was still going on. Much like what I'm doing today, talking about an epidemic that is controversial, you couldn't talk about MPD the way Hacking did, and he experienced some pushback, some abuse for it. And so he wrote Mad Travelers after his book Rewriting the Soul came out. He wrote Mad Travelers. And if you can see the subtitle, Reflections on the Reality of Transient Mental Illnesses. So Hacking defines a transient mental illness as an illness that appears at a place at a certain time, and then it fades away. So it can spread from place to place and reappear from time to time. And he didn't mean it comes and goes in this or that patient, but that it's a type of madness that only exists at certain times in certain places. And in the last chapter of Mad Travelers, there's a great quote where he's explaining why he chose fugue, this epidemic that no one's ever heard of. And he says it's because no one cares about hysterical fugue. I asked the questions about an obsolete diagnosis to prevent inflamed passions from obscuring our view. So before I go any further, I'd like to just acknowledge that I'm going to be talking about a diagnosis that is definitely not obsolete and definitely does inflame passions to the point that many people can't actually see what's going on. But I still think it's a really important discussion to be had. Now, another reason why I chose this book is because Hacking, he analyzes fugue, and he gives us this framework with which we can analyze all events like it, all transient mental illnesses or psychiatric epidemics. And I particularly love it because it's the metaphor of the ecological niche. And what Hacking is doing with this is he's demonstrating the complexity of this type of event, that it's not just social, it's not just medical, it's not just the patients, it's not just the doctors, it's all of these factors combining at just the right time, in just the right way, in just the right place for this type of epidemic to flourish. So he's got the four essential vectors. The medical world must give this type of illness legitimacy. It must be observable in order for it to spread. It must provide release. So despite it, typically there's pain involved in this disorder, but it has to provide release that's not available anywhere else in the culture in which it arises. And the last one is interesting, a cultural polarity. So Hacking is saying it's got to be situated between two aspects of contemporary culture, and one is romantic and virtuous, and the other is tending to crime or darker elements. And I'd like to add to that I think it's got to be attached to some sort of cultural obsession, some sort of cultural infatuation in order for this kind of illness to flourish.
Could I ask a quick question?
Yes.
Is there a slide that has that on?
I'm sorry, I'm not.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
Thank you.
I'm clicking on my laptop and not on my pointer. Okay, are we okay? Can I, because I'm going to flip to the next one. Is that all right? Thank you. There we go. So he gives us the ecological niche of fugue. Fugue, at the time, there was this big debate. Is it hysteria or is it epilepsy? And just because there was a debate in the medical world, it made it medically, theoretically interesting. It's really interesting, they had a system of surveillance in place because they had to be able to identify, not only were the men visible, walking in their trance on the road, but they had to be distinguishable from vagrants and draft dodgers, so they didn't end up shipped off to the military or put in prison. So they had these papers that would identify that they were fugueurs. It provided release. Now, it provided release for a particular class of men. He's independent. He's poor, but he's not so poor that he has no independence. He's also independent enough that he dreams of travel. And this is the crucial part, is this was the age of tourism. So if you want to understand these illnesses, you've got to understand the cultural fascination of the time. And this was the age of tourism. Tourism was not a thing before the 1860s. It was just the wealthy who traveled. And then the tourism industry comes along. Advertising is everywhere. Tourists are everywhere. Romantic journeys are in literature, and everyone's obsessed with journeys and tourism. And this slips into the mind of these men who are balancing on the brink of a breakdown, and we get this particular type of madness. The doctor who started it even called fugue pathological tourism. And then, before I move on, so many of these fugueurs, they lost their identity papers, which is, it feels as if they're kind of trying to throw off their old identity, which is something that people in states of depression and despair, they often do. They want a new version of themselves. They want to become someone new. Right, but it only lasted 22 years. And the reason it disappeared is, as the metaphor of the niche works really well, because if one factor, just as a species, if something in the niche changes, the species will die out. If one of these vectors, one of these factors disappears, the illness should disappear with it. And the medical world lost interest in hysteria. It was just gone. So the medical interest disappeared. And also tourism becomes more run-of-the-mill. It's not a cultural fascination, and society just moved on, and it's over. Now, I don't want to spend too long in the 19th century, but I have to mention Shako's hysteria before I move on. Because it is one of the, well, I think it's probably the best example of the medical world shaping psychiatric disorders. Shako, as you can see in the image, in the painting there, he was Jean-Martin Shako. He was a brilliant neurologist, a giant in the medical world in France at the time in the 1870s. He had done groundbreaking research on multiple sclerosis, neurosyphilis, and then he just went astray. And he becomes convinced that hysteria, which was, we now know, psychosomatic, but he became convinced it was neurological, and he devoted himself to mapping it. And so he comes up in 1875, he comes up with this unified theory of hysteria, and it's got 4 stages, the typical fainting, fits, convulsions, hallucinations, all the theatrics, and it's Charcot's hysteria. He was at the Salpêtrière Hospital in Paris, which is a sprawling institution with an insane asylum for women and a poorhouse. And remarkably, he didn't notice that many of the women were showing up at the asylum without symptoms of hysteria. And then they would find themselves in his care. And under hypnosis, they suddenly started producing symptoms of hysteria. And they would go through the 4 stages of Charcot's hysteria. And he was completely oblivious to the power of suggestibility. He just didn't realize he was inducing this into his patients. So then the epidemic, it's contained to the Salpêtrière, but then it starts to spread. And the vector for that is, he was a showman, and he opened up the Salpêtrière on a Tuesday for his famous Tuesday lectures. And he would parade his hysterics on the stage, hypnotize, and they would perform all the theatrics. He invited journalists and physicians from all over Europe. They would write it up in the medical journals, in the newspapers, and it dispersed throughout Europe. And then women of the upper classes started to produce Charcot's hysteria. They would have the fits and the convulsions and everything. And the reason it struck society women was because the medical journals would be found in the drawing rooms of the society women. They were coming across it. They would read the newspapers. And then it starts to show up in literature. So the culture is fascinated by Charcot's hysteria. The fits are in literature. Medical historian Edward Shorter has written beautifully about this, and he says some of the works of literature were like veritable do-it-yourself guides to Charcot-style fits. And it's a contagion. And the reason that we can be absolutely certain it was iatrogenic, which is because it disappeared as soon as Shako died. He died in 1893, and people knew that it was absurd. People in the medical world knew that it was absurd, but he was so powerful and so domineering that they couldn't challenge him while he was alive. So they just allowed this circus to continue. After he died, everybody was able to say this is absolute nonsense. And his form of hysteria disappeared and the epidemic was over. Here's the ecological niche. So medical, Shako made it interesting, made it medically interesting. It was observable with the theatrics, the Tuesday lectures. He used photography as well. Are we okay? Okay. He used photography as well, which was a new technology at the time, taking photographs of the hysterics. It provided release for these society women who were supposed to just sit passively waiting for marriage and show no emotion, and it provided some form of release from the oppression of the era. And then the cultural polarity, it was the romantic, virtuous woman and the fear of these women succumbing to vice. So another concept from Edward Shorter's symptom pool before we move into the 20th century. It's a set of, at any given time and in any given place, society has a set of symptoms or behaviors that are the culturally acceptable ways to express your mental distress. And this pool is going to evolve over time, influenced by medical knowledge, societal norms, cultural factors. So unhappy people just unconsciously select the symptoms of their time that will be recognized by the medical community and society, and people will take them seriously. Nobody now on the brink of a mental breakdown would start having a Shako style fit. Well, I wouldn't think so, because you won't be taken seriously, but at the time she would have been taken seriously, and the unconscious mind produces the symptoms. So the pain and distress are constant, but the way it's expressed and diagnosed shifts constantly with cultural and medical fashions. My pointer. So now here we are in the 20th century. I don't know in the short time that I have if I'm actually going to be able to convey the madness and the horror of multiple personality disorder, but I'll give it my best shot. This is the most harmful diagnosis that psychiatry produced in the 20th century. The theoretical foundation of it was the recovered memory therapy, the recovered memory movement, which was just outrageously pseudoscientific. And the thinking was that traumatic events, repeated traumatic events, including years of the most horrific child sex abuse, could be repressed, completely forgotten, until it was recovered by an expert in recovered memory therapy, built upon Freudian mumbo jumbo, basically, and they just took it to the extreme. Psychiatry just got swept up in this absurd belief system, and it resulted in hundreds of thousands of false accusations. Journalist Mark Pendergrass goes even further than that and suggests at the height that we were looking at about 1 million false accusations, loving parents being accused of the worst horrific sex abuse. Yes?
Isn't this coming back? Isn't this what they call today trauma? And, they diagnose normal people with.
Oh, it's like,
I wasn't here for that. Okay.
it's the book on the New York Times, The Body Keeps the Score. Have you seen it? It's a bestseller on the New York Times.
Yes.
And we have dissociative identity disorder. It's more a TikTok trend right now, and I hope that's where it stays. You'll see in a moment why I think I'm not that worried about dissociative identity disorder.
Clarification question. You said 1 million cases. Is that in the United States or worldwide?
This epidemic was actually contained to North America. There was a tiny little bit in the UK. It spilled a tiny little bit, but it was mostly contained. It's a journalist, and it was in 2017. He wrote a book, and it's very imprecise. We don't actually know, but he was looking at the number of recovered memory therapists in the United States and the percentage of women that they treated. So he estimates about 1 million false accusations a year at the height of the epidemic. And just imagine what that does to your family. Like, you have an adult daughter who suddenly is saying that you abused her for 10 years in the most horrendous way, and the burden of proof was flipped. You had to prove your innocence. You were guilty and you had to prove your innocence, and you could not prove your innocence. Absolutely horrifying. There's a Harvard psychology professor, Richard McNally, in 2005 called it the worst catastrophe to befall the mental health field since the lobotomy era. And in 2005, he was correct. I sadly do not believe that that's true anymore. The last thing I will talk about today, I think, has surpassed the horror of this. So multiple personality disorder, it built upon the pseudoscience of the recovered memory therapy, in that they claimed that in the act of repressing this terrible child abuse that occurred over so many years, the personality fractured. That was the way that the child coped, by developing different autonomous personalities living in the same body, and they were unaware of each other. You've got the host personality, and then you can have 16 different alternate personalities living within you who would take over just at random times. It started with about 16 alters. By the end of the absurdity, we're talking, I think the record was 4,500 alters in one woman was born out in therapy. So it really plunged into total absurdity. Pendergrast, again, he called it an incredible juggernaut of pseudoscience and malpractice, and I think that just sums it up perfectly. That's what it was. It was madness. I'll give you a quick timeline because I want to demonstrate Hacking's niche theory. The timeline really shows the theory of the niche. So Hacking, in his book, Rewriting the Soul, he rather mischievously says that multiple personality disorders sprang into being late in the afternoon of the 27th of July, 1885. And that's when Jules Voisin, who was a physician at a Paris asylum for men, he described the world's first multiple. This was a man called Louis Vivet, and he had 8 distinct personalities, apparently. But we have no epidemic. Seedlings start to sprout with another important piece on multiple personality, the dissociation of a personality by Morton Prince in 1905. And again, we still don't have an epidemic on our hands. We do get a mini epidemic with the release of The Three Faces of Eve in 1957, which was a book and a film released the same year. And the multiples in that time had, guess how many alters? The Three Faces of Eve, they have 3. They have 3 distinct personalities, and they all look a lot like Eve, but it's very contained. It's not an enormous epidemic. For the epidemic, we need Sybil. This is a book by Flora Rita Schreiber. It was supposed to be nonfiction. We now know it was not nonfiction. It was completely fictional. They made it all up. And Sybil was a woman supposedly who had 16 alter personalities. And the reason she had those is because she had experienced years and years of terrible abuse at the hands of her mother. I don't think the father, I think it was just the mother. So the book comes out in 1973 and the movie comes out in 1976, and then we are off. We've got an epidemic. So MPD enthusiasts, they lobby the American Psychiatric Association very, very aggressively, and they get multiple personality disorder as an official diagnosis in the DSM-3, which came out in 1980. They get their professional association. If anyone knows anything about the gender issue, you might be seeing some patterns here. You might be seeing some similarities, because they get their professional association 1984, then they get a journal in 1988. And the epidemic is just raging. So this was an extremely rare psychiatric disorder prior to 1975. The maximum you could ever find in case history is about 200, but estimates are way lower than that in all of medical history. And then between 1975 and 1995, we're looking at 25,000 to 40,000 diagnosed cases. And then it just collapses. It collapses under the weight of its own absurdity, because it was outrageous pseudoscience. terrible harm was done, million-dollar lawsuits are won, and the whole thing collapses. They take out MPD from the DSM, they rebrand as dissociative identity disorder, and kind of try and sweep it under the carpet as really. Now, I don't have a graph of referrals, but I do have this graph just to show the
Can I ask a clarifying question about your previous slide?
Oh, do you want me to go back?
No, I remember it. When the lawsuits were won, you didn't say who won.
Oh, the women. The women sued the recovered memory therapists and the multiple personality disorder experts.
Got it.
For yeah, many lawsuits were won. As soon as the first lawsuits were won, insurance companies panicked, cut the insurance. So it collapsed, but it just collapsed in an avalanche of lawsuits, as it should have. That's just the publication, like there was almost no interest whatsoever, and then it explodes. We get tons of interest, tons of medical interest, and then it peters off again. It's still around. We haven't really got rid of it, as you say, but it's not what it was. So who were the women, quickly? They were women, first of all, 90% of them were women. Average age 30, they were white, lower middle class, they were housewives. In the beginning, when Sybil came around, they had, on average, about 16 alters. Typically, they would always have a childlike alter, which is, you can see them hugging their teddy bears. This is taken from a multiple personality disorder session by one of the leading experts at the time, Colin Ross. They would have a promiscuous alter, they would have a prudish alter, and then it plunges into, we get so far from reality. They get, you've got animals, there's a lobster alter, there's a cloud alter, somebody had a squadron that was flying around the hospital ward alter. It was absolutely absurd. One woman, Joan Casellas, she calls them the women that feminism left behind. So these types of mad moments often happen when there's huge societal upheaval. And these were the women, feminism had liberated women, and they had gone out into the workforce, and many women were really thriving and embraced the changes. And these were the women that got left behind. They're still the housewives. And Acasella suggests that there was no pride left in that. They were then looked down on. Their lives hadn't changed that much, but they didn't have the solidarity of all the women, womanhood. That's your lot in life. And so they felt like failures. They would show up just with issues of depression, postpartum depression, eating disorders, alcohol addiction, marital issues, just average, normal mental health symptoms. And they just had the misfortune to find themselves in the room, in the clinic of these recovered memory therapists, these multiple personality disorder experts, so-called, who would then just plant the memories of child abuse into their minds through hypnosis and then draw out all of these alter personalities. They cued them out of the women, basically. It was all iatrogenic, doctor-induced. Many of them, it's been suggested, would, if MPD hadn't been in the symptom pool of the time, they would have likely been given a diagnosis of borderline personality disorder, which also made it into the DSM in 1980. It's a classic symptom of the unstable sense of self. You don't really know who you are. You're changing appearance, and your personality can flip very, very quickly. They were very suggestible, they were easy to hypnotize, and crucially, they had to be in therapy. You didn't develop multiple personality disorder in the beginning unless you were in therapy, because that's the only way it was induced into patients by the therapists. So she's just basically lonely, she's in pain, she's confused, she feels shame about her failings, and she just finds herself colliding with a true believer. And that sends her life into a completely different direction. She is then accusing her father or her mother or her grandfather, uncle, of terrible crimes. And he cannot, or she cannot, defend herself because, as I said, burden of proof. You have to prove your innocence, and there's just no way to do that. It's niche. So it was medical. MPD activists got it into the DSM. And then, if you know anything about gender, this is going to sound familiar. An entire MPD industry with specialized clinics just appears all over North America. It was highly observable. It's maybe difficult to understand if you weren't alive at the time, and I was too young to understand, but I try and understand like how saturated the culture was with this recovered memory, with this multiple personality. They were on talk shows, there were news articles, there were celebrities coming out as multiples and talking about their child abuse. This was an era that was obsessed with child abuse. And that's because nobody believed that child abuse was happening, apparently, until 1961. We get battered baby syndrome. X-rays reveal that babies are actually being abused by their parents. And this caused a whole wave of child protection movement. Everybody's obsessed with child abuse. And then we get this cultural fascination that was just enough to line up on the niche. The women, it's released from life's failings. Now they're not downtrodden and broken, they're survivors. It gives them release from feeling like a failure. And then we have the romantic, in the 1980s, you can be whoever you want to be, the ideas about identity and self combining with this obsession with child abuse, the child protection movement, and then the pseudoscience of the recovered memory movement. Now, it's a long quote before we get to trends, because I just think it's really important. So Dr. Paul McHugh, he actually he was the psychiatrist in chief at Johns Hopkins in the 1970s, and he shut down John Money's gender clinic. The first wave of the medical experiment, Paul McHugh was there front line, and they followed up the men, it was mostly men, going through the gender clinic, and they just decided that they were not improving their lives. They were colluding with a mental illness. They were not improving their lives. So McHugh shut down the gender clinic. And then he turned his attention to multiple personality disorder. He was a massive critic of it. He spoke out very strongly. And in 1995, he wrote these words, that at least once a decade, psychiatry gets swept up by an enthusiasm for a fundamentally incoherent practice, and then must spend at least 10 years subsequently digging out of the troubles that this practice produced. These misdirections of psychiatry rest squarely on standard medical mistakes such as oversimplification, misplaced emphasis, or pure invention. The enthusiasms for these misdirections, however, usually derive from an uncritical acceptance of transient cultural attitudes and fashionable ideas. The repeated combination of these elements proves how all too often the discipline of psychiatry has been held captive to culture to the detriment of everyone. So recovered memory, MPD, and the satanic panic, which is, I can't even go there, but it was outrageous, even more outrageous than the other two. It's pure invention. It's psychiatry falling captive to a mad idea that has no grounding in truth, and they cause terrible harm. So now we go to the next time psychiatry did that, where we are now once again captive to culture, fashionable ideas, oversimplification, and pure invention. The timeline of trends, I'll blast through this. And again, this is going to show hacking's niche and how everything has to line up before you get the epidemic. In 1906, we got the first attempt at sex reassignment. We do not have an epidemic on our hands. 1952, George Jurgensen had traveled to Denmark, undergone hormonal and surgical treatment, and he comes back to the US as the sensational Christine Jurgensen. Front page news in the New York Daily News, the blonde bombshell, blonde beauty. And this was really sensational and a lot of media attention. And we do get a mini epidemic. But at this time, it's more, Jurgensen's doctor was inundated with thousands of letters from desperate people begging for this medical treatment. These people at this time, the tiny, tiny epidemic would have been autogynephilic men, which would be men who have a paraphilia in which they are aroused by the thought and image of themselves as women, and they want hormonal and surgical intervention to embody the object of their own desire. And they would have been a small number of homosexuals living in a very homophobic world who wanted a hormonal and surgical solution to escape their sexuality, which is what Jurgensen himself said he was. He said he was a gay man, he didn't want to be gay, and he sought treatment in Denmark to alleviate that. He became a woman. Then Johns Hopkins, 1966, John Money opens his infamous gender clinic. Paul McHugh shuts him down in 1979. We get our professional association in 1978, the Harry Benjamin International Gender Dysphoria Association, HIBIGDA, which was later to become the World Professional Association for Transgender Health. If you're familiar with my work, you'll know I have a thing or two to say about them, but that's not for this seminar. In 1980, transsexualism gets into the DSM. Then we still don't have an epidemic on our hands because all of the cultural factors are not yet lined up perfectly. We don't have the niche. The first pediatric gender clinic opens at Boston's Children's Hospital in 2007, and the same year Barbara Walters introduces the world to the concept of the transgender child with this segment, 2020 segment, featuring a very sweet, adorable Jazz Jennings, a little boy whose mother socially transitioned him at age 4 or 5, I think, told him he was a girl. Now we're getting to the epidemic. 2014, if you remember from the graph, that's the inflection point. That's when it all starts. So 2 things happen then. First of all, the Dutch publish this deeply flawed and yet somehow groundbreaking study that forms the foundation of the puberty suppression experiment. And then that's it, the epidemic begins. I'll get to the cultural factor in a minute. So pediatric gender clinics all over the Western world then start to see this enormous surge in adolescents, mostly adolescent girls, being referred to gender clinics. In 2018, Dr. Lisa Lippman coins the term rapid onset gender dysphoria in a paper, hypothesizing that there's perhaps a peer influence, social contagion element to this massive surge. Trans activists are absolutely livid. The backlash was swift and vicious, and they tried to suppress the paper. And in 2019, British detransitioner Kira Bell launches the first legal action claiming that she was a young lesbian woman. She says she was harmed by gender-affirming care. And there's so many, too many to name. There's so many lawsuits ongoing right now. So here's your graph. I don't know if you can see very clearly. We can see 2014, 2015, and we're off. We've got Spain, United Kingdom, Germany, and Sweden. But there's graphs like this for any nation where, any nation that is touched by the modern trans rights movement. You're going to see a graph from a pediatric gender clinic that looks an awful lot like this. So there's the puberty suppression experiment in 2014, that's one thing, but there's more to it than that, and that's this. And this is only a tiny taste. I couldn't fit that much on. Time magazine, you see, in 2014, June 2014, Time magazine announces the transgender tipping point, America's next civil rights frontier, and we are off. Trans rights movement has officially launched in earnest, and the messaging is now everywhere. Caitlyn Jenner comes out as a Woman of the Year, I do believe, in 2015. There he is on the cover of Vanity Fair. I Am Jazz, the reality TV show watched by millions, first airs in 2015. That's Louis Theroux. He did a transgender kids documentary, 2014. This is just a tiny snippet. The messaging is everywhere, and we are now a culture obsessed with trans rights. The T in the corner, if you're like me, a little bit too old to know what that is, that's Tumblr. The contagion, social media is really important in this, of course. This is where it's spreading. It starts to spread on Tumblr. The contagion is very active on Tumblr in the early 2010s, and then it just bursts out. It bursts out into the mainstream with YouTube, then we get Instagram, then we get TikTok, where I think it's really all happening. To me, TikTok today or YouTube with the trans influencers, you know, they're prancing around with their mastectomy scars, they're taking testosterone, they're showing how wonderful it is to transition. That's the modern day version of Shako's Tuesday lectures. That's you know, the MPD talk shows, everything. This is the modern day version, and it's at the fingertips of every adolescent, every young person in a state of mental distress, 24 hours a day. Now, with this rights movement came psychiatry's oversimplification, and that is that being transgender is all about having a mismatched gender identity residing in your body, and there's nothing you can do about that. You can't change the gender identity, you can only change the body. That's an oversimplification of an extremely complex psychiatric disorder with so many different life paths, life challenges that lead a person to identify as transgender, but they just oversimplified it for the sake of the political movement. Then we have the pure invention of the children who are born in the wrong body. This is magical thinking. There's no science to this whatsoever. The pseudoscience of the girl brain in the boy body, which is what Jazz Jennings, there's a book for children, there's a line. Jazz Jennings says, I have a girl brain in a boy body. That's what it means to be transgender. That's pure invention. That's not true. And we're teaching it to kids as if it's true. The very concept of the transgender child is another pure invention of psychiatry. It may be offensive to some people to say this, but it's really not true. There are children who are gender nonconforming, but you cannot be born transgender. There's just simply no such thing as this transgender child. Psychiatry has fallen captive to culture, this culture, and here we are. So rather than this mismatched gender soul that is trapped in the wrong sex body, that's the oversimplification, we need to look at what's really going on. And that is gender dysphoria is a symptom of some kind of life challenge. Now I've got what's spanning around here. I did put autogynephilia on here because it's necessary that it be on there, but I don't believe we've got a social contagion of autogynephilia. That's a sexuality. It's not part of the social. Some people think it might be increasing because of availability of online porn, and that's definitely, someone needs to research that. But as far as I can see, we're not dealing with a social contagion of autogynephilia. For me, gender dysphoria, because it's in the symptom pool of our time, so anyone who's in pain and is trying to make sense of their pain and is looking for answers, they can select gender dysphoria and apply it to their lives and use it to make sense of their struggles and their difficulties. So I've got autism up there, for example. A person with autism often feels like they don't really fit in and they don't feel comfortable in their body and they don't really understand why they're different from everyone else. And because we're infatuated with trans rights and gender dysphoria is right there in the symptom pool, taking a prominent place, this autistic young person can just select gender dysphoria. And then that means with that, they believe themselves to be transgender. And then they go to these gender clinics and they get affirmed and medical treatment. It could be internalized homophobia. So a gender nonconforming lesbian who she might make sense, she is experiencing gender dysphoria. She does feel discomfort with her sex body because she's an extremely masculine woman. Gender dysphoria is in the symptom pool of our time. She can select that, apply it to her life, and think that that makes her a man. A girl who's experienced a sexual assault, she might be experiencing gender dysphoria too. She might actually hate her female body because it's vulnerable, and she might seek to escape that vulnerability by thinking she has gender dysphoria. That means she's transgender, and then she can take testosterone and supposedly become a man. In our madness, we're medicalizing puberty. I really think we are. Because if you look at the diagnostic criteria of gender dysphoria, one of the criteria, it's It's something like hatred of your secondary sex characteristics. Now, I could give you homework. I could send you all out today and find me a teenager who doesn't hate their developing secondary sex characteristics. I think it would be a really difficult assignment. So anyone who hates their developing body, because gender dysphoria is so prominent in the symptom pool of our time, they can just select it. And with it comes they are trans, and then they find themselves in these affirming clinics and on a medical pathway that I believe they very likely will end up regretting. So this one seems to strike a broader demographic. It seems to strike more people than the ones I described in the past, but I don't think that's technically true, in that what all these people have in common is they're vulnerable, they're in pain, they're fragile, and they're at a low point in their life. They're looking for answers, they're looking for a solution, and they are seduced by gender identity ideology. It sells them the promise of a miracle cure. They can be a new person. They can take hormones, have surgery. They can be happy, and they're just young. They're not necessarily minors. They're not necessarily under 18s. They can be young, vulnerable adults. They haven't yet found their place in the world. They haven't figured out their identity. They haven't figured out their sexuality, and they just collide with this ideology, and it sets them on the wrong path. So just as Albert Dada, he had a breakdown in a culture that was infatuated with travel and tourism, and then he went on his mad journeys. Or the multiples, they had their breakdown in a culture that was obsessed with child abuse and recovered memory therapy, and they got sent down a different path. These young people are just suffering in a culture saturated by gender identity ideology and then the absolute pseudoscience of gender affirming care. I think it's also more widespread because children and adolescents are just being bombarded with this messaging in schools, in television shows, by celebrities, on social media, in books. No one in the 19th century taught school children that you could be born with an innate fugue identity. Impossible. I will tell you this, multiple personality, the therapists, the enthusiasts, they did try and get childhood MPD into the DSM, and thankfully failed, because can you imagine? And no one was teaching children in the 1980s that you could have tens or hundreds or thousands of alternate personalities living inside your body. Can you even imagine the mayhem that would have ensued if that's what we had done? And yet we teach our children that they can have a mismatched gender soul, as if that's scientific fact. So gender identity ideology, it's a belief system, and it is being taught as if it's scientific fact. And it's a belief that is coursing through the hyper-connected networks of cyberspace at lightning speed. It's just psychiatry and the medical world has embraced this bonkers belief system. Can't really describe it any other way. It's ecological niche. So it was going on for about 100 years, right? From the first attempt at sex change, it had been going on for about 100 years before we get an actual epidemic which supports Hacking's niche theory completely. We needed some sort of medical fascination. In the early days, doctors were not that keen on this whole sex change thing. It was the men, the autogynephilic men, and their burning desire for these hormonal and surgical interventions. They kind of dragged the reluctant surgeons and doctors along with them, and most of the medical world found it absolutely repulsive. But then it comes to the puberty suppression. Massively excited Norman Spack of Boston Children's, he recalls salivating at the prospect of using puberty blockers on a trans-identified, so-called transgender child. There was so much excitement with this experiment, and at the same time it coincides with the modern trans rights movement, framing hormones and surgeries as a human right, so you cannot deny this medical treatment. It's obviously highly visible. I mean, celebrities coming out as trans get like front page adoration. Everybody goes wild for it. Adolescents in schools, they get celebrated, and they get a welcoming tribe, and everybody is so happy and cheering them on. There are trans influencers everywhere on social media, TikTok, YouTube. I don't blame them because they're part of this contagion too, and they're just young and they don't know what harm they're causing. And of course, the simple things like in social media profiles, you always see the pronouns and you see the flags. So it's a very visible disorder. Now, release, I've talked about puberty. Isolation is exactly that. You find your tribe. You come out as trans. You may be isolated. You don't really understand why you don't have friends. You're on your own. And then you come out as trans and you find your tribe, a welcoming tribe of people who are happy to bring you into the fold. I get pushback on this one, oppressor guilt. I've heard this from detransitioners. I didn't make this up. When we separated society into the oppressor and the oppressed, and we made it, there's some sort of, we made victimhood appealing, okay? So you don't want to be the evil, white, so-called cisgender, heterosexual oppressor. And these young people, if they are white, cisgender, heterosexual, and they're looking at their lives and they're miserable and they don't understand how they could possibly be an oppressor, they can just adopt they, them pronouns, and then they become the oppressed. And the they, them, it seems silly and it's just non-binary and it's just having fun, but it can be a gateway. You're they, them first, and then you move in this world, and then you become he, him, and then there's medical, or they medicalize non-binary identities, and I won't go there now. Escaping womanhood, I honestly think a lot of these girls, they don't think that they're boys, they don't want to be boys, they just don't want to be girls. And I think that's really important, and when we chop their breasts off when they're 16, when we pump them full of testosterone and steal their fertility, what we're doing is we're stealing we're letting them opt out of womanhood before they've even experienced it. And on the other side, toxic masculinity, when we made everything about being a man toxic, everything about being masculine is toxic, I think a lot of the boys, and I have heard this from male detransitioners, they didn't want to be the toxic male. They didn't feel like the toxic male, and then they somehow at their lowest point thought maybe that means that that's because I'm a woman, and then they ended up on this path. So it provides release from a lot of different issues. And then our cultural polarity, we've got the obsession with trans rights, obviously. And then we have the polarity. People are so desperate to be inclusive and progressive and accepting, and we have this fanatical support of trans rights as a result, contrasted with this terrible fear of being bigoted and intolerant and transphobic. Being transphobic is probably the worst crime you can commit. And that means that people, when I was obsessed with why are people looking the other way, I think that's the answer. That big massive surge, the contagion, everything, I think people look the other way out of fear because they think it will make them a bad person if they question. So I blacked out faces. I blurred out faces because these are just young people and they're victims, and I don't want to show their faces. But
maybe on another slide.
Oh, I'm sorry. Almost had it. Almost made it to the end. Yeah, I blacked out their faces because it breaks my heart. There, of course, will be people who disagree with the ideas that I've presented today. And for those people, I want them to consider, what if I am right, okay? Because if I'm right, then these young people are the fugues and the hysterics and the multiples of our time. So the fugues and Shako's hysterics were lucky in that when the mad cultural moment passed, they could just move on because they were unscathed. It was just, life went on. Okay, I did something crazy, but life goes on. The multiples were not so lucky. So I've spoken about multiple personality disorder a lot, and it shocks me that somebody will come up to me and tell me afterwards, my daughter accused me, and she still believes that I did that to her when I didn't. So these multiples, they never got past, many of them never got past the horrors that these therapists planted into their mind. They still believe to this day that their fathers, their mothers, their grandparents did this terrible thing to them. They never got their happy childhoods back. And many of the loving parents died with the accusations hanging over their heads, and some are still alive today with those allegations. But their daughters still believe the memories. So the harm was so enormous. And if I'm right in what I've said today, then these young people are being even more harmed, because they'll never get their body parts back. They'll never undo the effects of the hormones. Many will never have children, and many have likely had years or decades taken off their lives. Their health is gone. This is not an inconsequential medical pathway. This is a health-destroying medical pathway. The trauma of the parents, the siblings, the grandparents who are watching this be done to their beloved children, you can't undo that. So if I'm right, we're inverting the penises of the fugueurs of our time. We're amputating the healthy breasts of the multiples of our time. And we're performing hysterectomies on the hysterics of our time. Shako actually did not support hysterectomies for hysterics. He didn't believe that that would do anything, but others of his time did. And we look back in horror at what was done to those women. They unnecessarily had their reproductive organs stolen from them. So imagine, if I'm right, what people of the future will think about our time. That's it. Thank you.
And those of you online, if you will raise your hands online, I'll try to get to you too. Yeah, go ahead. And
Do I choose?
You get to choose.
Oh, goodness. Okay, I'll go right here because you.
Okay, here's the issue, that there are people born with two X's and a Y, and there are people born with the disorder where the body doesn't take up the testosterone. So that's a situation of, so let's take the second disorder where you're born with a gene that doesn't take up the testosterone.
Yeah.
So you are born XY, but you're not masculinized, right? I don't think you would disagree that those are cases, technically, of take the second one, of a male in a female body. I don't know how you class it out. Obviously, we're talking about incredibly rare disorders. I get it. But don't you think just denying the existence of any of this gives ammunition to the rest of them saying, no, look.
Well, first of all, I don't think I'm denying the existence. You're talking about, well, intersex was the old term, and I don't know if they find it offensive now. I can never keep up with where we're up to on the language, but disorders of sexual development. These are individuals born with chromosomal abnormalities that the reproductive organs don't form fully. Those are not transgender people. They're actually a completely, entirely separate group that have nothing to do with transgender people. And the trans movement conflates the two, because the interesting thing is they want it to be born this way. They want to make it that transgender people are born this way, and intersex, that helps. You can conflate with a medical condition. They're born this way. They need medicalized. They need medical support. We've never discovered the biological source of gender identities. I believe that's because they don't exist. It's a thing of pure invention, but they're two separate things. And the medical path for intersex or DSDs is very different to what it should be for people who identify as transgender, because they have an actual medical condition and they can make decisions based upon that. For people who identify as transgender, it's a very diverse group. And I'm not saying transgender people don't exist. I believe it's political identity, and they very much do exist in our time. I just think your medical treatment should always, the doctor should treat the person in the room before them. The doctor should not treat a political identity. So the doctor should see the person in the room what is motivating them to seek hormonal and surgical body modification, and therefore you can decide, is this appropriate or not? Does that answer your question?
I just worry that when you said it just doesn't exist, somebody who doesn't understand the subtlety between the genetic, well-established, I should use the word misformation, genetic mistake, should we say, versus there's none of that. It's just somebody announcing that they want it. And differentiating those two very clear cases, I think is one of the issues here.
It's very important to do so because one is a medical condition and one is a psychiatric disorder, and you really do need to separate the two. They have nothing in common. Chris, do you have something to add?
Sure, I had a question too.
Oh, do you want to add to? Oh, sorry.
We gotta keep them moving because I'm seeing hands going up and everywhere. So just
Is it okay to video?
that's up to me.
Video me, it's fine, of course. The people in the room, I don't think so.
Not me. Okay.
No. Okay, so do you want? Okay, go.
I'll ask a question. I will say really quickly, XXY is a condition called Klinefelter syndrome affecting only males. Their testicles might not grow as big. They might have reduced sperm production. All these intersex disorders, these different conditions, they all affect male or female. They're not both sexes. But I have a question based on one of the internal emails that were leaked in the WPATH files. So you wrote this report about the WPATH files from the World Professional Association for Transgender Health. And one of the internal messages from these doctors says that trauma is common among trans clients. Nonetheless, I'm surprised to find that several of my clients met criteria for dissociative disorders, which we're talking about. I was wondering if other people have noticed these incidents among their clients, and whether there's been any difficulty with the medical system agreeing to transition them, especially given that not all of their alters have the same gender identity. So multiple personality disorder was debunked, yet here they are in recent years still pushing that they have alters.
Yeah, if you know anything about WPATH, that shouldn't surprise you at all that they've embraced this thoroughly debunked multiple personality disorder pseudoscience. And yeah, they have this whole thing where they don't know how to provide medical intervention for the individuals who have 8 different people living inside them, and some are male and some are female. So what do you do with the body? Because the internal conversation, they can't agree on how to medicalize. WPATH, please don't ever think that WPATH is a real medical organization. It is fraudulent to the point of being criminal and absolutely has no business setting medical standards of care.
What we can't stand for.
World Professional Association for Transgender Health. If you look on my Twitter profile, you can find the report that I wrote about them. Really, they are not a professional association. Gentlemen in the...
Yeah, hi. I have a couple of points and a question. I have a career of 30 years in high-level diagnostics of neurologic disease as a physician and researcher. I want to make one big point, which is that psychiatry has always had a problem. All psychiatric illnesses. Why? Because it's subjective. Generally, there is rare genetic stuff, but that's not the majority. And so I came into medicine in the beginning of MRI. And MRI and PET scanning have been desperately used to try to find objective criteria for psychiatric disorders, illnesses, whatever you want to say. It's extremely difficult. And so your presentation is basically, essentially all opinion. I happen to agree with it. But I'm just saying that's the criticism, but it's the same thing for all the disorders of almost all are subjective and arguable, and they can't find things. And I've published papers in correlative stuff with schizophrenia, et cetera. It's very difficult. And that brings me to 2 other points. Number one, the NIH is extremely harmful in this whole area, as they are in many areas, because they don't just decide what specific projects are funded. They say, we're going to fund this topic. And people whose careers are completely tied to an NIH grant, meaning every single academic physician and academic scientist, they're going to do the research, they're going to come up with something, and it's almost all garbage. It's correlative. A lot of stuff you even showed is correlative, and that's just not cause and effect. And I want to close with the question of homosexuality. Okay, a few years ago, in Brazil, they did an anonymous sexuality survey, massive. And it's a very heterogeneous society with a lot of sexual differences and things. And the incidence of people being homosexual was roughly 3%. This was an anonymous survey. I'm not saying that's fact. I'm just saying that's what their data was. In the United States now, and I think this is related to what you're talking about, we see in colleges, there are surveys of freshmen, sophomores in our American colleges, 30, 35, 40% are saying they're gay or questioning what gender they are. And I just think it brings up the whole phenomenon of social contagion. I call it a social contagion. I'm not sure where that fits into what this is or what you think about the whole idea of even homosexuality now being an epidemic in the United States.
I think gender, trans identities, being queer, whatever on earth that means, certainly a social contagion. I mean, you can just see it. It's exploded in the youth population, striking teenage girls the most. It's got all the hallmarks of social contagion. As for homosexuality, I do not think that true homosexuality is a social contagion. I remember being at school, in high school in the 1990s, and I remember the friends who went through their lesbian stage, not because they're lesbians, they're now married, they have children, and they've not had a lesbian relationship in a long time, but it was just, they were just adolescents and experimenting. And
I just want to clarify, I'm not saying homosexuality is a social contagion, but I'm worried that 30, 35, 40% of college students now don't know if they're heterosexual or homosexual.
Right.
This is an epidemic, the way you describe it. Epidemic.
Very much so, and the reason is the modern trans rights movement and bombarding young people with these messages when they're in a very crucial stage of identity development, when they don't know who they are yet. And there's also, it can destabilize them even more if they don't even know the meaning of male and female. They don't know if they're male or female. The person they're dating doesn't know if they're male or female. We've got non-binary thrown in there. How do you even define your sexuality when you don't even know what the word sex means? Of course, we're confusing them, and it's an enormous social contagion. And it would be funny and quirky and harmless if it were not for the medical interventions and the fact that we're actually removing healthy body parts and stealing fertility and their futures from them.
So one of the things you show to us is that as these things develop, clinics were opened, right, to address this. And so if you're a parent, with a troubled kids and you see there is a clinic, right, it's very conducive to this. And so it's very alarming to see that, like the medical profession does these things potentially not based as much on science if this is not so basic. So what do you think are potentially the economic incentives? Is it that, here is the possibility to have new drugs or new surgeries or new things? And it's truly alarming to see, how the medical profession goes along with this.
I think there's certainly a financial incentive somewhere, but I don't think that's predominantly what drives this. I think that the people are true believers. We're in a time when large numbers of people in society believe something that is not true. They believe in the existence of the transgender child, the transgender adolescent, and there's only one way to alleviate their suffering, and that's with puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, and the surgeries while they're still developing. People believe something that is not true, and I've spent a lot of time, as Chris was saying, I wrote the WPATH files, so I've spent a lot of time in the world of these people, reading their words, listening to them speak, trying to understand who they are. And I don't believe that they are motivated by profit. I don't even believe that they are evil people setting out to ruin lives. I think they are true believers in a false ideology, and they really think that they're helping these kids. They really think that there's no other way to help them and there's no other way to set them on the path to a healthy, happy life.
I just want to follow this quickly. There's economic incentive, but there's also economic possibility. And I agree with you, they're not in it for the money, they can do plastic surgery. But insurance is paying, the government is paying. If you had to pay for this out of pocket, it would undoubtedly, the ability of true believers to deliver this would be much smaller now.
Oh, absolutely, and it's hard to say, because on the one hand, it's to me it's not medicine, because medicine doesn't destroy healthy bodies, and so it's cosmetic body modification, and therefore should not actually, you should be paying out of pocket. But because we have this idea that they have gender dysphoria, we created this psychiatric disorder, and as I'm sure you understand, the DSM is largely a work of fiction, and we just create these disorders out of nowhere, and we give them a billing code, and then there's your medical treatment. But yeah, like I tend to think people should be paying for their own body modification, because it's not improving their health, and therefore it's not medicine. But that's, we created this mess, we let this idea loose in society, and there are an awful lot of people who really do truly believe that they are transgender, and they really do truly believe that their only road to happiness is this brutal medical pathway. So we've got to shift the cultural thinking and try and just reduce the epidemic, reduce the number of people who come to the conclusion that they need to do this to their body in order to be happy.
The other thing about that is that having insurance pay for it really legitimizes it for us parents. But I want to say thank you so much for coming here. It's really nice to see you here. It's really hard to parent right now here at this place and in the Bay Area. And one thing, as I try to, ever since 2020, it's been really hard, but as I try to understand, especially since like following the W path thing, and some of it's so dark, castration fetish amongst the people who are making the rules, it's frightening. But as a parent, I always look forward to trying to get my kids into a good college. And it seems like these ideas come out of fancy colleges, but here we are in a fancy college, and that's exciting. But you didn't talk about these ideas coming through colleges. It seems like you're saying they came from this idea of the medical doctors. And so is there hope for colleges, or do you think that it worked together?
It definitely, yeah, maybe I actually should have included education. Of course, it's coming through education. I have children, and I right now do not want them going to university. I live in Canada. I do not want my children going to university, even though I have inoculated them, I believe, completely against this poisonous idea. I still would fear for them going into the school system, because it's all coming through the colleges. Is there hope? Oh goodness! I mean, I hope there's hope. I think
One step removed from that.
understanding the problem is the first step, and having conversations like this is obviously important. People willing to listen. Maybe not everyone in this room agrees with me, and you're right, it is my opinion. It's just what I've come to from all the reading that I've done, and people can have a completely different opinion. Just having the conversation is something that is not happening on college campuses at all, and that if we want to find our way out of this mess, we have to talk about it. Okay.
Thanks for your presentation. I'm a professor of pediatrics here in the School of Medicine, so I'm keenly interested in this topic. It was just one quick comment. Our professional organization, the American Academy of Pediatrics, is quite a socially liberal organization. I think the leadership may even concede that, and so it finds a very welcome ear there to promote some of the ideas of gender blocking drugs in prepubertal children. I think having friends who have transgendered and having seen them really so happy with that experience as adults, I'm of two minds, and I really like to have those friends and appreciate that that's been positive for them. But as a pediatrician, I just feel it's so risky and harmful to flip this switch. Almost every cell in the body has receptors for sex hormones, and the notion that you can somehow just sort of stop it and then maybe later turn it back on is is really false. So those are just my comments. I would say that the notion of historically that legal actions sort of may hasten an end to some of the hysteria or rise of these phenomena. And now we see some of the initial legal actions in this area. I would also think we should appeal to our colleagues, my colleagues in the School of Medicine here, who are scientists first, who in any other realm of their professional life would so critically, if you propose giving a medicine that was received by a receptor in every cell of the body, they would never agree to it. Yet I think for social reasons, somehow this therapy seems to be okay. And I wonder if you have any insight into, as professionals, medical professionals, is there a hope to appeal to just scientific rigor and say, let's just look at these data more critically, let's take pause. Is that gaining any traction anywhere that you're aware of?
Well, Europe has fully backed away from this. So North America now is the outlier, Canada and the US. We are the outliers. The American Academy of Pediatrics has an awful lot to answer for. Yes, Europe has basically done, they looked at the evidence. We have the CAS report out of England, which was a 4-year-long thorough investigation of the Youth Gender Service in the UK, discovered that there's no evidence. There's just no evidence to support blocking the puberty of young people. And when you consider the drastic life-altering impact, health impact, you cannot justify doing that based on the flimsiest, weakest of evidence. So in the US, it's political. And how do you shift the medical world back to evidence-based medicine, away from ideology-based medicine? That I'm afraid I can't answer.
There's a couple of questions from online. Dave Henderson, you've been very patient.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, John. And thank you for your great talk. Mia or Maya?
Mia.
Mia, thank you, Mia. Great talk. I was the one who asked about the lawsuits, and that was one of the things that gave me my biggest hope. The previous questioner mentioned it, but I just want to point out that, you're in Canada, but you've paid attention to America. We are lawsuit happy. So the most positive, hopeful thing I got out of your talk is that the lawsuits turned away that MPD. And so I think we're going to, I think the odds are very high we're going to see a lot of those. And I want to know what you think about it. And the other thing, just an empirical question. In America, how many people do you think roughly have been transitioned who were transitioned under the age of 18?
Oh, I did have numbers somewhere. With your healthcare system being as it is without the centralized record keeping, it's just so hard. Maybe even Chris, can you pull out some numbers for me?
Well, I can speak to this quickly if you want.
Okay, sure. Billboard Chris is in the audience, and he can.
I travel the world raising awareness about this issue, but I'm not nearly as smart as Mia. But the New York Times reported 300,000 children in the United States had been diagnosed with gender dysphoria. Now, keep in mind, they're not always receiving this diagnosis. Jamie Reed, a whistleblower from the Gender Clinic in Missouri, said maybe half the time they're actually getting that official diagnosis. But Reuters has an article with actual numbers, so does the Manhattan Institute, based on insurance data. So not private pay. The most recent data did not include Kaiser Health plans. It didn't include kids who were covered under their parents' Veteran Affairs Administration plans. But it's tens of thousands given puberty blockers and cross-sex hormone, given surgeries, sorry. And we're into the tens of thousands for puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones. It's approximately 2-to-1 for the cross-sex hormones versus the puberty blockers. And anywhere from 50 to 179 children under the age of 12 and a half received a double mastectomy.
How many? What?
So the insurance data, there's a range, this is conservative numbers, from 50 to 179 girls under 12 and a half had double mastectomies.
Okay, I've just pulled up the latest one from Do No Harm, which is an American organization. It's shocking numbers. So for medically unnecessary bilateral mastectomies for minors, we've got 4,160 But what's shocking to me is 660 phalloplasties. I don't know if you know what a phalloplasty is.
Cut off your penis.
I think it's honestly the worst crime the medical world has ever committed. It's when they strip the skin from the forearm and they fashion it into an appendage, stretch out the urethra, and then sew it onto the woman's groin, and it's supposed to be a neopenis. The complication rate is astronomical. And if I'm reading this correctly, they've done 660 of those procedures on under 18s since this is between 2019 and 2023.
And it's important to note too, again, that's only insurance data.
And that's only insurance.
Not including Kaiser, not including donor money, not including Veterans Affairs.
Yeah.
So the numbers are actually much higher.
Much higher.
And
And
so
I'm
what
sorry,
about-
I've forgotten. What was your other question?
The other question was about the lawsuits, because we in America, and we in California especially, are so lawsuit happy. It strikes me, we're going to see a lot of lawsuits going against this, aren't we?
I would think that the lawsuits bring it down eventually. I wish I could remember, there's a state, or maybe there are two states who've done what every state needs to do, and that is increase the statute of limitations. They increase it to when the young person turns 40. Because the biggest obstacle to a lawsuit right now is the statute of limitations being 2 years. A young person who transitions, there's a honeymoon period where they think that everything is great and they've done the right thing, and then the regret starts to set in, and the average time to detransition is about 8 years. And then once they've detransitioned, they find themselves in the darkest of places. And a malpractice lawsuit is so hard to launch. First of all, you need financial backing, but you also need the mental strength to go through that. And most detransitioners are in a very fragile, terrible place, and they're not there. So do you know which state it is? One state, I'm quite sure, has increased the statute of limitations to the young person when they turn 40. That gives them plenty of time. And just doing that alone should make insurance companies very, very wary of offering this treatment pathway that is not medicine.
And how did the Kirabel suit go, the British one in 2019?
Well, so Kirabel, I worded it as legal action. It wasn't a lawsuit, it was a judicial review. She launched a judicial review against the NHS, claiming that they failed her, that she couldn't have consented and she was rushed. The High Court ruled in her favor, saying children could not consent to puberty blockers, and that the clinic could not just treat puberty blockers as a single treatment, but had to consider the fact that 98 to 100% of the kids who are put on blockers go on to cross-sex hormones. And then that ruling was overturned at the Court of Appeal, but it was only overturned on a technicality in that the High Court had ruled that if the Tavistock Clinic wanted to put a child on that treatment pathway, they had to go through the courts. And the appeal court said that's overstepping and it's up to the doctors. So none of the findings were overturned, but the actual technicality of it was overturned.
Thank you.
We only have 2 minutes. Dave Butker or Marcus Denton had stuff in the comment. Do you guys want to say something? Very short. Looks like no. Mia, thank you very much.
Question
I'm sorry, John, go for it. Short.
I'm curious, you mentioned that ADHD and anxiety thing, which I feel like is maybe partially correlated with this. Like, I'm curious if you have any thoughts on just the lower bar for ADHD and anxiety diagnoses, and also any thoughts on cross-country differences. It seems like all these issues are very much concentrated in the Anglosphere, maybe Germany, much more malleable cultures than, say, other parts of Western Europe or Japan or elsewhere.
They're concentrated anywhere that has been hit by the modern trans rights movement, because it is absolutely tied completely to the modern trans rights movement and the messaging. That's what triggered the contagion. And so my next report that is coming out is all about the DSM and diagnoses. As I said, the DSM is largely a work of fiction, and we have got so much overdiagnosis of ADHD and autism and anxiety and anything, and I don't know that people are benefiting from receiving all of these diagnoses. That's a separate issue in and of itself, but you do see in the gender clinics, if you look at the demographics, if you look at the data, there's a high prevalence of kids who've been diagnosed with ADHD. Whether or not they actually have it, that's debatable. Very high prevalence of autism, anxiety. I just think all that links them together is that they're having a hard time in life. They're struggling and they want a solution, and they're teenagers. And remember what you were like when you were a teenager? You wanted a quick fix right now. This is going to do it for me. And they latch on to the transgender identity. This is going to make me happier. This makes sense to me. The crime is what is being done in gender clinics, that the adults in the room, the adults who are supposed to protect these kids, are going along with it and just medicalizing them.
Yeah, thank you. That was wonderful.